My name is Dan, and I'm going through the Star Wars Expanded Universe in publication order for my first time through, not in chronological events, but as they were published. And so that's including things like the novelizations, unofficial sequels, all these books that we have behind me. Also, I have comics that I'm going through, films, video games. I've recently ordered newspaper strippings of the dailies coming out, as well as Mad Magazine. And so I'm trying to go through everything that I can. It should take about, I said 4 months to get through the 70s, 80s. I think that's going to be expanded to much further because there's just so much that we're uncovering. And so if that seems of interest to you, come along with me. The first two books to come out were the novelization of Star Wars and Splinter of the Mind's Eye. The novelization was based on an earlier script before the film came out. And then Splinter of the Mind's Eye was meant to be sort of an unofficial sequel to the film in case they didn't blow up and things. But these are very different from what we would expect from Star Wars. They almost feel more like an Arthur C. Clarke or a Star Trek, something like that. They're very space jargony. The novelization still has a lot of humor. It's just very pulpy. And then Splinter of the Mind's Eye is almost, it's more mythic and solemn and that sort of vibe. And I really like both of these. But it's very different from what we get with the other stuff coming out. There were comics coming out. That was kind of the drip feed for Star Wars fans to get more of those adventures. They weren't talking about the rebellion and the empire. Instead, they would go on these different little adventures to keep them occupied. And it would be more like Magnificent Seven or something like Flash Gordon. This is Marvel and they're doing what Marvel does best. But there were also the dailies and a number of things. But the first thing that really felt like Star Wars was walking in its stride or comfortable in its own skin was the Star Wars Adventures. And I love the other things that came out, but they feel a little bit like artifacts of their time, and you can love them for what they are, but they don't especially mesh super well with the stuff that came out later. But I think this one does. And these three novels do a number of things really well. It is happening before the events of the film. It's not really escalating towards the film, but it's establishing a pattern that we will recognize by the time we get to the film and by the time we get to Han and Chewie. And to just jump the gun, these stories are going to be a part of my mental headcanon or whatever you want to call that. But we'll go into a few things that I think Brian Daley does exceptionally well. Now, I have to talk about the early comics again because the Han Solo adventures take some of that same format. And I'm meaning comic issues. The first 6 issues have to do with the events of the film. And then from about 7 or 8 till about 18, the characters are just being occupied on different planets with different things that are coming up that don't really matter on the grand scheme of things, it seems. But it's still keeping the characters occupied in a lot of ways. It's still doing that with Han Solo here. There's no Skywalkers. There's no mythic Jedi at this point. These books take on a format that perfectly highlight Han and Chewie and the pattern that they always seem to be in. Now, we have to talk about the context a little bit about these books. There's no empire that Han and Chewie are running away from. They're not even really mentioned all that much, if at all. But we have the corporate sector authority out on these outer planets that Han and Chewie are finding themselves on. And they're not presented exactly the same as the Empire. They don't have a Tarkin or a Vader or an Emperor or someone like that. They apply heavy administrative pressure, more of a bureaucratic pressure than what the Empire does, where it's a little bit more overt. They're blowing up planets and things. But with the corporate sector authority, there's more waivers and permits and restricted airspace and cargo checks and things like that. Stuff that the Emperor still does, but that's just the way that Brian Daley goes about, navigating a story with Han and Chewie in the same sort of light. And Han and Chewie are doing things that are considered illegal, so it's not like there isn't a high level of pressure, even though it isn't the Empire coming after them. But it's a more localized, bureaucratic, governing body. It feels more grounded in a lot of ways than the Empire. You just expect everyone on the Empire to be doing bad things, but we have the corporate sector authority. There are people just doing their jobs within the corporate sector authority, but also there are bad apples. And actually, there's a lot of nuance. And I think Brian Daley does an excellent job with all of that. So structurally, I have some notes here, and it does kind of echo the comics in a lot of ways, but it's a little more grounded and it's presented in, its novel format. And it does the same sort of thing 3 times in each of these books. I wrote down the structure that I found. First, Han and Chewie need money. A big score presents itself. A new girl is introduced to Han in different circumstances. The job becomes morally complicated. Han crosses a line he refuses to tolerate. They survive. They remain broke. And then by the end, Han gets to walk off into the sunset, still looking pretty cool. And so by the time we get to the film, even though they don't do something as big as destroying the Death Star, we do develop a pattern and know Han and Chewie maybe better than they even know themselves. Because Han always talks the talk and how he's always just looking out for himself, but that's not really true. One of the jobs is an extraction job that turns into a sort of prison liberation. Another one is a slaver job where he's supposed to transport some individuals and it turns into dismantling trafficking. And another one is a sort of treasure hunt. And as I've said, I think it's a great way of keeping them occupied, much like what the comics are doing, but it still develops them great. I just want to point out, if there was ever any question as to whether Han shoots first and if that's in his nature, read this book, read the comics as well. It is so obvious that that is Han's nature, and he even talks about it in each of the books. I think it was in chapter 5 of the first book. A door opens and Han just blasts away because the tension is already high and he doesn't want to take a risk. And when confronted with this, he says, I happen to like to shoot first as opposed to shooting second. He's always calculating and watching, and if things are starting to get tense, he escalates, and he doesn't take the risk of seeing what would happen if they fire first. And as an aside, and this has to do with Brian Daley, but also with just Han being created himself and really relying on instinct, I think he's just a great counter to Luke in a lot of ways. Where Han always talks about trusting instinct, we have Luke that's being taught to trust the Force and something external to him. And I think that's a great interplay, even though Luke is still about trusting some level of instinct but welcoming the Force. But anyway, that's going down in the weeds. One of the key things that feels like a major tonal breakthrough with this book, as opposed to some of the other stuff that's come before it, is it's funny. And not just kind of pulpy, silly funny, it's confidently funny. The middle book, Han Solo's Revenge, is probably my favorite of the 3, but I love all of them. With the beginning of it, Han and Chewie are making ends meet by having this mobile drive-in theater sort of thing for aliens on that dusty planet. And so they'll just show anything that they can get their hands on. And when everyone's gathered, Han presents this video that shows a water planet, and everyone just gets whipped up into a religious frenzy, not a metaphorical sort of frenzy, an actual frenzy, because they've never seen water in this sort of abundance. And so Han and Chewie literally have to get out of there with their lives, and I think it's funny. The most important part is the humor meshes so well with the direness of what is happening in a lot of these stories. These aren't goofy stories. They are played seriously. I can pretty confidently say that Brian Daley handles this aspect better than anyone else up to this point in the publication timeline. He plays within that sandbox beautifully, and it makes me even more excited to get to the radio dramas. There's a number of situations that I wrote down that I think would be great to talk about, but it would be more spoilery, and they're just fun. So I would recommend going to those books. And I do have a link to a copy of these books if you'd like to get your own. Up to this point, I already loved Star Wars, but reading these things felt more like artifacts of the time, which I did love, but I didn't get ever as emotionally tied as I did with Bollocks and Blue Max. Bollocks is an old droid, not just an older model, but just old. He's not necessarily the smartest, he's not powerful, he's just Bollocks. And his biggest fear that actually makes him super relatable is obsolescence. He doesn't want to be replaced. He feels like at any time he could just be scrapped and not matter anymore. And so he's always pushing to be of use, even though he might not be the best one for the job. And inside of his chest cavity rides Blue Max. He's a cutting-edge, ultra-level processing droid with genius-level computational speeds and everything else. He's a little bit arrogant, and he resides within Bollocks. And so they are a walking contradiction. Old hardware, ultra genius software. And where C3PO and R2D2 were constantly bickering, we don't necessarily have it in the same way, but they definitely have different perspectives. And as we go through the three novels, it becomes less of a host and passenger and more of a partnership. And actually, for my money and the time it took to read these books, reading about Bollocks and Blue Max totally made it worth it on their own. Blue Max picks up some lingo from Han, and he does so without any self-awareness. And Bollocks is very cautious, and he's always just trying to be useful. And I think that's a very human thing that we're discovering. I don't know if it's a faux pas to bring up Star Trek, but one of my favorite characters of all time is Data. And I get so much humanity from that character. And I felt that same thing in some ways with Bollocks. Brian Daley did such a good job developing new characters within these books that I will continue to think about. Even though these are more grounded, we have ancient tyrants, killer robots, lost treasure vaults, knife scars, quick draw showdowns. It is so much fun. It's still a lot like the comic structure in some ways, but it feels more grounded and very lived in, and it feels like the galaxy can just stretch and tell a multitude of stories. And clearly, it's been successful at it. One of my favorite little nods at the end is while Han and Chewie are basically economically in the same place, they've heard that Jabba pays well, so maybe we can go talk to him. And it also talks about the Kessel Run, but it pushes us towards the Mos Eisley Cantina. The three Han Solo adventures might not be the most important in the grand scheme of things, but they certainly are the most stable up to this point. The tone works, the humor works, the characters work. They can tell stories that are apart from Luke Skywalker and the Empire and all of that, and it just works. Not always at full power, obviously not at mythic scale, but cleanly. And I think that's exactly what needed to happen before The Empire Strikes Back would come out and deepen everything. In the next video, I'm going back to the Marvel comics between issues 18 to about 40, leading up to The Empire Strikes Back. It is an awesome run of comics. The Empire rears its ugly head. I get another droid that's my favorite. I think his name was Master Calm. Just awesome. I'm waiting for the newspaper clippings to come out because those are happening at the same time, but we'll have to cover those maybe in about a month from now. But I'll get to those, and it's going to be so much fun, and even Mad Magazine and things. And we'll finally get to the events of The Empire Strikes Back. If you want to see more of these videos, the best way is to go to the playlist where they'll all just be compiled and they'll live there. But I'll see you in the next video and in the comments below. I love hearing from you.